There are few historical subjects as direct and objective as personal close combat. Methods and skills either prove they worked in real conditions or failed and people died. From the time of the ancient Greeks onward, Western civilization has always been a source of uniquely resourceful ideas and specialized innovation. For better or worse, the same technical ingenuity that was applied to classical arts and sciences was directed equally towards the personal skills of battle and individual weapons of war. Fencing history was hardly one of a linear evolutionary progression from cruder cutting with heavy blades to superior thrusting with lighter ones, as has so often been recklessly asserted. What took place is simple to understand. With each generation, on fewer and fewer occasions, fewer and fewer swordsmen fought with fewer kinds of swords, under fewer conditions, against fewer kinds of arms or armors. The evolution of hand weapons and fencing styles in European culture did not occur in a straight line and did not proceed in an environment immune from the transformation wrought by firearms and cannon. Over time, weapons and fighting methods each altered in response to changing military and social factors. The cause through which Renaissance martial arts rapidly faded and were lost to the modern era is almost entirely due to the impact of ballistic technology on Western civilization. With the emergence of modern militaries in the new age of firearms and cannon, the environment and conditions under which warriors engaged with swords and other hand weapons was much less frequent, far less demanding, and not nearly as diverse as it had been in the pre-Baroque era. As the needs of fighting men changed over the generations, there was correspondingly an increasing disconnect from older personal combat methods. By the early 18th century, fewer fighting men were any longer obliged by circumstance to learn the use of diverse arms and armor, and had fewer opportunities to employ such skills in earnest. Fencing by the 19th century constrained to become far more specialized and narrowly focused on formal duels of gentlemanly single combat with secondary considerations for light cavalry. Even within the limited military use of sabers, broadswords, and cutlasses, gone now were any concerns for fighting against dissimilar weaponry, polearms, shields, or armors. Virtually absent now were concerns over closing techniques for seizing and disarming, grappling and wrestling, two-weapon combinations, multiple opponents, etc. In effect, the considerations that encompassed all-out fighting for a martial art of either battlefield utility or general self-defense during the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Traditions of medieval and Renaissance fighting arts did not survive until later centuries as any living lineage. Over time, through disuse and neglect, the necessity for close combat skill with older arms and armor vanished and were replaced by newer concerns, primarily for ritual duels and sporting play. Virtually nothing survived the generations to be retained and passed on by later fencing masters, using tools and methods devised for wholly different conditions of self-defense. With no need for later generations to learn them and no incentive to practice them, earlier systems of armed and unarmed self-defense deteriorated. Not surprisingly, what was not modified withered and died, or at least survived only in sporting form. Whereas Renaissance martial arts developed under a far more challenging martial environment by comparison, Fencing styles of the modern era reflect a narrowing specialization. This process of demartialization transpired as part of a natural progression, which occurred as changing military technology and social pressures altered the conditions and circumstances for employing hand-to-hand weaponry. Knowledge of the characteristics and functioning of earlier sword forms was lost as the craft of fencing contracted to the use of light single-handed blades designed more for dueling and sport. As a result, modern fencers and fencing historians have invariably approached the subject with a connect-the-dots version of history, tracing recognizable elements as if mere vestigial parts while ignoring the larger whole they can't identify. Focused on gentlemanly duels of single combat with single identical swords under fair conditions of rules and etiquette, their perspective has been skewed. With little surviving from pre-Renaissance fighting arts, they interpreted older, unfamiliar armors and heavier weapons designed for battlefield close combat or street fighting by the prism of what little they have been able to appreciate through their own Baroque-derived fencing styles. Having transitioned to more specialized applications of swordsmanship, they lost not only the broader fighting skills of old, but the vital understanding of how and why they existed, as well as by what specific manners they were once practiced and taught. Instead, for several centuries, fencing in the modern era focused on substantially different kinds of tools employed under different martial conditions than in previous ages. Without focus on the core aspects of historical close combat as true self-defense disciplines, swordsmanship and other combative activities narrowed and specialized or died out entirely. There was a cultural and practical disconnect as concern for form and certain aesthetics came to dominate over function in how certain men chose to defend themselves from one another. The long tradition of dueling itself slowly civilized into virtual farce. As the martial necessity of the art and science of personal combat decreased with each generation, secondary roles associated with recreational, ritualistic, and sporting elements came to eventually overshadow and even replace the craft's original self-defense function. Later centuries saw only limited and narrow application of swords and traditional arms in Europe, only some of which survived for a time to become martial sports. In this transition away from traditional military skills and martial arts, there was a process at work of stylization and commercialization, a phenomenon that today continues to afflict the study of all the world's traditional martial arts.